Hello knitters, Barbara Benson here. I'm an independent knitwear designer who also likes to make videos here on my YouTube channel, Watch Barbara Knit. Make sure to check in the description below where you will find links to anything I talk about in the video, including how to get my patterns to knit up for yourself, how to join the Watch Barbara Knit Facebook group, and how to support me on Patreon. Today, I am going to talk about something that came up in a discussion recently, and it ties into what I just said. I said, hello, I'm Barbara Benson, and I am an independent knitwear designer. What is an independent knitwear designer? That is, or they're frequently referred to as what is an indie, I-N-D-I-E or I-N-D-Y, indie designers. What in knitwear and in crochet and everything, what does it mean to be an independent designer? And you know what? I don't know that anyone's ever really talked about what they mean. And frankly, it's not like you can go to the dictionary, go to Merriam-Webster and find it under a definition. So what I'm going to talk about is my general understanding of what an indie designer is based on actually being one and talking to a bunch of other designers who consider themselves indie designers and what that means. And it's just kind of fun. To understand it, we have to start with a little bit of story time, a little bit of a history lesson. We need to go once upon a time in the knitting industry. And again, I want to preface this with this is before my time, and my understanding of it is, surface level to an extent. I do not have detailed firsthand knowledge of how things worked back in the day. And I'm sure there are people who can go way more in depth into how it worked, but I'm going to share with you what I've heard and learned and figured out. And back in the day, knitting patterns really existed for one purpose and one purpose only. And that is to sell yarn. That is why they were published. I'm not talking about like way, way back when it was just because people needed to get clothes on their body, but patterns published in magazines, in newspapers, on the backs of yarn labels. Those written and printed, published patterns really were intended to sell yarn. That is what they were there to do. The designers who created those patterns were employed by the yarn companies. And even to this day, so I'm sure some of the larger yarn companies still employ knitwear designers or have employees that part of their job is to design knitwear and write knitwear patterns, and so that they can publish them. So your magazines, like, Ladies Home Journal used to print knitting patterns, and it's a distinct possibility that there was a person that their whole job was to write knitting patterns for Ladies Home Journal, or that they it was part of someone else's job. But those patterns were written for and owned by the magazines or the yarn companies that published them, and they were there to either sell magazines or sell pamphlets or sell the yarn. But the definition here and where I'm going with this is that those designers were employees of these companies. It was part of their job. They were not independent. They were paid for their efforts, and then the patterns themselves, the copyright to them, were owned by whomever paid them. An independent knitwear designer is someone who is not employed by a company to write knitwear patterns or crochet patterns or what have you, if that makes sense. And when I say not employed, I mean not like salaried, not like an actual employee of the company with benefits and whatever goes with it. Independent designers, while they still may write for magazines and they still may write for books, are all independent business people. When they work for people like that, it is under a contract basis, not as an employee. So you get into, it's essentially like being any other sort of entrepreneur, right? So the huge change in how knitting patterns were written and distributed came with the advent of the internet. This box that you're on right now pretty much changed everything for everybody, and it had huge impact on the knitting industry. Initially with people putting things on knitting blogs, and then there were online knitting magazines, the biggest name there being Knitty, where they were publishing knitting patterns for the sake of publishing knitting patterns, as opposed to for the sake of selling yarn. The patterns were just designed because some designer felt the impulse to design it. And the way that the early knitting magazines worked, like Knitty, is, again, it's contract work. It's the designer designs something, they write it, they photograph it, they send it in as a submission, and then that Knitty decides whether or not they're going to publish it. And at that point, we'll pay them an honorarium for using their pattern. But the copyright remains with the designer. And there's all kinds of complicated rigmarole that went on with copyright. And I don't want to give the impression that there wasn't a really substantial struggle to come to terms with who actually has the copyright on the written pattern, magazines, publishers versus the designers. But very, let's go, the SpongeBob SquarePants. So 3 years later, the end result is now independent knitwear designers write their own patterns, source their own yarn, mostly do their own photography or hire someone to do the photography. They hire editors. They are, as much as a designer, they're a manager and a project manager, having to handle all the different elements of producing a pattern, and then also handling the distribution of the pattern, which is predominantly via the internet and websites like Ravelry. Ravelry was the game changer for independent designers. Ravelry was one of the very earliest, also Pattern Fish, to allow a designer to upload a PDF and then get paid for it. So it is direct between the crafting public and the designer, and the product itself is the pattern, not you're getting this pattern with the yarn. So it's a big difference. And so independent designers are independent business people that their job is to write knitting or crochet or embroidery or what have you. They're not being paid by any other, like they're not an employee. I mean, they might be getting paid. And that is one of the big things about being an independent designer. If you want to attempt to at least have a shot at being able to support yourself, you have to have multiple income streams. Most knitwear or crochet, I can't speak 100% for crochet designers, but most knitwear designers, yes, they write and sell knitting patterns, but they also will write patterns for yarn companies, and they will under contract, and they will write patterns for magazines and books under contract. And a lot of people try to teach. And again, that's as an independent contractor and having to apply to the individual places where you teach. And you're a contractor. You are not an employee, so you are independent. At the very top end of independent designers, you have designers who have actually started their own publication companies, their own imprint, where they have self-published books and they run the whole shebang themselves. And then there are independent designers who have gotten book contracts with publishers. Just because you have gotten that contract with the publisher does not make you any less independent or any less of an indie designer, because the only thing that publisher is paying you for is the work you've done. You're not an employee. You don't get benefits. You file completely different tax forms, etc., etc., etc. You're not an employee. The people who are employees of the publishers are the editors and the people who do the layout and the design and everything, but the authors are all independent. They're not on the payroll. You just get a check if your product sells, and if your product doesn't sell, you don't get a check. And that's the way it works. And that's the way being an independent designer and independent business person works. You are taking the risk on yourself, because if you're paying for models and photography and tech editing and website hosting and all the things you need, you put that product out there and people may or may not buy it. Whereas when you're an employee of a yarn company and you're writing that pattern for the yarn company owns the pattern, but they also own the risk. If nobody likes that pattern and ergo it sells no yarn, then that is on the yarn company, not on the designer. So I hope this is making some sense, because, you know, the end goal, like the star that I think a lot of indie designers are aiming for, is self-sufficiency. Being able to support themselves, being able to contribute to their household's income level, being able to even get to the point where you can actually become an employer, where you can hire other people to work with you. I do know designers who have managed to create a situation where they've had to hire assistants, and that is fantastic. And having that level of success, hitting that point where you have a very successful website, where you maybe have branched out into selling your own notions or your own knitting bags or your own yarn line, collaborating with other yarn companies, and maybe even having like a yarn line where you designed the colors and it's branded with your name, having a very successful social media presence to the point where you're a influencer or whatever. Just because you've achieved these things doesn't make you less of an indie designer, because honestly, being able to be self-sustaining and things like that, I think, is a goal of a lot, if not the majority, of indie designers. So if we were to say, well, once you've hit a certain level, you're not indie anymore, it's kind of disingenuous, because you're still indie. If you're still your own boss and you're still the person who decides what patterns get published and what yarn gets and all that kind of stuff, if you're not on someone else's payroll, you're still independent. You're still an indie. And, you know, we have a huge range of people, from people just getting started all the way up to incredibly experienced and very successful independent designers, and everything in between. And the person just getting started that only has 5 patterns to their names, if they're self-employed and if they're doing their best and if they're presenting themselves professionally and writing professional patterns, then they're an indie designer. And the person with 20,000 Instagram followers and teaching and commanding top dollar for speaking engagements, still an indie designer. They're still independent. And that is one of the attractions to the career, if you will, because you're your own boss. It's the same thing as with any other entrepreneurial endeavor. You get to follow your own passion, and you get to do the things that you want to do and pursue the avenues that you want to pursue, as opposed to working for a yarn company who says, here's the yarn, we need you to design a cropped sweater. And that's great. And if that's what you want to do, those positions do exist. And I'm not saying anything bad about having that be your job, because frankly, that has its own set of rewards in being able to just like, okay, I can design this. It's good. I turned it in. I have done my job and I have done it well. And I've designed something beautiful. It makes that person no less of an amazing knitwear designer. They're just not an indie designer, and there's room in this world for all of them. And just, you know, I can't even say that publishing your own patterns is a bar, because you can have an entirely viable business plan where all you're doing is submitting to magazines, designing for yarn companies, working with yarn companies, working with magazines. You can never publish a single PDF pattern selling directly to the public and still be an independent designer, because you're nobody's employee. You're your own boss and you get to decide what you're going to do. So I don't know if any of y'all have made it this far. I don't know if you were interested in this at all, but there is a brief overview of what makes an indie designer. What is an indie designer? It's a knitwear designer, or at this point, knitwear, crochet, embroidery, whatever. That's their own boss. That's an entrepreneur, and that they write their own business plans and they pay their own bills and they file their own taxes, just like everybody else. So if you have any more questions about this, or if you think I'm totally wacky, if you have a lot of experience in the old school way of doing things, I'd love to hear about it in the comments, because that is definitely because things have changed, and because back in the day, things were so different. We didn't have the internet and nobody was blogging and telling everybody what was going on. It would be a shame to lose that information about how things were and how things have changed, like the history of this type of design industry. Would be fun. I love talking about knitting. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, click that like button. And if you would like to be notified whenever I upload a new video, please subscribe to my channel and select notifications. Thank you so much.